It was a quiet afternoon at Windsor Castle, the kind that made the old stone walls feel warm rather than cold. The sky outside was pale grey, the way it often gets in England when autumn starts to settle in. Leaves had begun to turn gold and red in the gardens, and the ground staff moved slowly along the paths, raking and tidying without urgency. Inside the castle, life moved at its usual measured pace. Footsteps echoed in long corridors. Clocks ticked in sitting rooms. Members of the household staff carried trays, sorted letters, and spoke in low, careful voices. It was a place where order was not simply expected, it was the very air that people breathed. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, was in the East Courtyard that afternoon, finishing a conversation about an upcoming equestrian program. She had her arms folded the way she always did when she was listening closely, her expression focused and sharp. She was a woman who liked things done properly and quickly, and she had very little patience for anything in between. The man she was speaking with knew this, and he kept his sentences short and his answers precise. George had been having a perfectly normal afternoon. He was 9 years old, full of energy, and, like most 9-year-olds, deeply interested in anything that looked as though it was not meant to be touched or explored. He had been walking through the East Corridor earlier that day, not entirely by accident, and not entirely with permission, when he noticed something unusual. A door that was usually flush with the wall, almost invisible, had been left slightly open. Just a crack. Just enough to notice. He should have kept walking. He knew that. But the gap in the wall was dark and interesting things had a powerful effect on George. He pushed the door open a little more, peered inside, and saw a passageway. It was narrow and old, with stone walls and a low ceiling, lit by a single small bulb that gave off a pale yellow light. It smelled of stone dust and something woody, like old furniture. He stepped inside. The door, as old doors sometimes do, swung shut behind him with a heavy click. He tried the handle. There was no handle on the inside. There was nothing but smooth old iron and a surface that would not move, no matter how much he pushed or pulled. He pressed his shoulder against it. He tried knocking. He called out, but the walls were thick and the corridor outside was not a busy one. Nobody heard him. He was not immediately frightened. He was, if anything, briefly fascinated. The room beyond the door was small and rectangular, with a vaulted stone ceiling and walls that were covered in faint markings, old measurements, it looked like, written in chalk by workers from another century. There was a wooden crate in one corner with old cloth draped over it. There was a narrow iron ring on one wall, bolted into the stone. George sat down on the floor, crossed his legs, and waited. When waiting stopped feeling useful, he began tapping on the wall with his knuckle, a quiet, steady rhythm, not a panicked banging, just something to do with his hands. James Hartwell had been a Royal Protection Officer for 15 years. He was not a man who missed things. He had trained himself, over many years of careful practice, to notice small details, a shadow where there should not be one, a sound that did not quite belong. He moved through spaces with a kind of quiet attention that most people never develop, the kind that comes not from worry but from years of practice. He was completing his routine security sweep of the East Wing that afternoon. The area had been partially closed off for several weeks because of a heritage restoration project. Margaret Coyle's engineering team had been working on the stonework in several sections of the corridor, and the area was not part of the usual daily foot traffic. Hartwell moved through it anyway, as he always did, checking doors and surfaces and corners with the same careful eye he brought to every sweep. He was about to turn back toward the main corridor when he heard it. It was faint, barely there, actually. A soft, regular tapping, coming from somewhere inside the wall. He stopped walking. He stood completely still and listened. The tapping continued. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats again. It had the rhythm of someone who was bored or anxious, not someone who was in immediate distress, but it was unmistakably human. Hartwell moved closer to the section of paneling from which the sound seemed to come. He placed his hand flat against the wood and felt nothing unusual. Then he leaned close and spoke in a calm, even voice. "Hello. Can you hear me?" There was a pause. Then a voice from the other side, clear, surprised, and unmistakably young. "Yes. I'm in here. The door's shut and I can't open it." Hartwell kept his voice steady. "Are you hurt?" "No," said the voice. I'm just stuck. All right. Stay where you are. I'm going to get help. Keep talking to me, can you do that? Yes, said the voice. And then, after a brief moment, it's quite interesting in here, actually. There's writing on the walls. Hartwell pressed his radio and made the call. The alert reached Princess, and 3 minutes later, the duty officer approached her mid-sentence, which was not something that happened unless the matter was serious. She read the message on the device he handed her, looked up once, and said 2 words to the men she had been speaking with, "Excuse me." Then she walked, very quickly, toward the east wing. She did not run. Running in a palace corridor sends a message that the situation has gone beyond control, and nothing about Princess Anne's manner had ever suggested that any situation was beyond her control. She walked with the kind of purposeful speed that makes other people step aside without being asked, and by the time she reached the sealed section of the east corridor, she had already thought through most of what needed to happen. There were 2 protection officers near the panel, speaking in low voices. Sir Edward Pembroke, the deputy head of household, stood a little way back with his hands clasped behind him and the expression of a man who very much wished he were somewhere else. Margaret Coyle, the head of the restoration team, was crouched over a set of architectural drawings spread across a folding table, tracing lines with her finger. Princess Anne looked at all of them for a moment. Then she spoke. She asked Hartwell to maintain constant, calm contact with George through the wall, talking to him, asking him questions, keeping the conversation going. She asked Coyle directly and specifically whether the paneling could be carefully opened without risk of anything falling toward the interior of the chamber. She asked Pembroke to retrieve the full architectural archive for this section of the wing and to do it within 10 minutes. Coyle looked up from her drawings. She was a calm, experienced woman, not easily rattled, and she appreciated being asked a direct question. She said yes, the panel was hinged and its construction was known. If the hinge mechanism could be accessed from the edge of the frame, the door could be opened safely. Then do that, said Princess Anne simply, and moved to the wall. She stood close to the panel and spoke toward it in a clear, unhurried voice. George. It's Aunt Anne. I want you to know that everyone is here and you are going to be out very shortly. A pause. Then, hello, Aunt Anne. Are you comfortable? A bit cold. But there's a wooden crate I can sit on. Good. Use it. She paused. Tell me about the writing on the walls. What does it say? And so, while Coyle's team worked quietly and efficiently at the edge of the paneling, Princess Anne stood at the wall and had a conversation with her great-nephew about chalk markings made by builders in the 1870s. She told him that those builders would have used the room as a measuring and planning space during one of the castle's many renovation periods. George found this very interesting. He said the numbers went all the way up to the ceiling in one corner and that some of them had been crossed out and rewritten. That sounds like an argument, Princess Anne said. George laughed. The sound carried clearly through the stone, and several people in the corridor quietly exhaled. Coyle's team worked without rushing, which was exactly the right approach. The panel was old and the mechanism was precise, and the worst thing that could happen would be to hurry and cause the frame to shift. 2 of her engineers worked on the hinge line with careful tools, easing rather than forcing, reading the resistance of the old metal before applying any pressure. The temporary lighting they had set up along the corridor gave them a clear view of what they were doing. 22 minutes passed from the moment the decision was made to open the panel to the moment it finally gave way. The door swung outward slowly and smoothly, releasing a breath of cool, dusty air. And there was George, standing just inside, with a small piece of carved stone in his hand that he had picked up from the chamber floor, and an expression on his face that was half relieved and half enormously pleased with himself. Princess Anne looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman who has seen a great many things in her life and has learned to assess them quickly. She reached forward, straightened his collar, checked his eyes with the brisk efficiency of someone well used to assessing people after unexpected events, and said, "You are entirely fine." George held up the piece of carved stone. "Can I keep this?" "No," she said. He put it down, though not without a moment of consideration. Catherine arrived 40 minutes after the first alert had gone out. She had been on her way to a private engagement when the message came through, and she had turned around immediately. She was composed when she walked into the east corridor, as she nearly always was in difficult moments, but the people around her noticed the way her eyes went straight to George the moment she saw him, and the way she held him when she reached him, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but for a long moment, and with both arms. George said that he was fine and that it was quite an interesting room, actually. Catherine said that she was very glad to hear it. Later, after George had been taken for a warm drink and something to eat, Catherine found Officer Hartwell in the corridor. She thanked him by name, directly and specifically, without any ceremony. She mentioned that his calm and his attentiveness had made a difference. Hartwell said it was simply his job. She said she knew that, and she was thanking him anyway. The questions that followed the incident were handled carefully and without blame. How had a door been left open in a restricted area? The restoration team reviewed their entry and exit procedures for that section of the corridor. A check was placed on all interior access points near active heritage work. Coyle cooperated fully with every review and was straightforward about what had happened. A door had been left slightly unlatched during a busy morning when two teams had been working in the same area. It was not carelessness. It was the kind of small oversight that happens in busy, complex environments and that good procedures are designed to catch. The procedural recommendations that came out of the review were adopted quickly and quietly. When a senior household official later asked Princess and whether she had any formal observations to submit for the record, she said that Officer Hartwell's response had been exemplary and deserved formal recognition, that Coyle's team had performed with great skill and efficiency under an unexpected kind of pressure, and that the castle's architectural archive had taken 11 minutes to arrive when she had specifically asked for it in 10. The official noted this down. When the official asked whether she found the overall response satisfactory, she said that a 9-year-old boy had been found safe and that everyone who needed to do their job had done it. She considered that the definition of satisfactory. George, for his part, spoke about the chamber for several days afterward with the enthusiasm of someone who had made a genuine discovery. He described the chalk numbers, the stone walls, the wooden crate, the iron ring, the way the air smelled, and the small piece of carved stone that he had not been permitted to keep. He said he thought the room must have been used by very serious people for a very serious purpose, and he wanted to know more about it. Arrangements were made, some weeks later, for the castle's historian to sit with him and explain what the room had actually been used for. George asked a great many questions. The historian, who had spent 40 years answering questions about Windsor Castle, said afterward that he had rarely met someone his age who listened so carefully. What remained, in the days and weeks that followed, was not the event itself but the way it had been handled. A child had been safe. The people around him had been calm and capable. A woman who had spent her entire life in service to others had stood beside a stone wall and kept a small boy steady with her voice and her presence, not because it was dramatic, and not because anyone was watching, but simply because it needed to be done and she was the one there to do it. That, in the end, was the only kind of courage that truly mattered. The quiet kind. The steady kind. The kind that shows up without an audience, does what is needed, and walks away without asking to be noticed. Princess Anne never spoke publicly about that afternoon at Windsor. She had no interest in speaking about it. She went about the rest of her week, the meetings, the engagements, the correspondence, with the same efficiency and focus she brought to everything else. If anyone asked, she would have said that nothing particularly remarkable had happened. A child got stuck. People helped. That was all. But the people who had been there knew differently. They had watched her arrive and assess a complicated situation in under a minute. They had watched her give clear, direct instructions without raising her voice or showing the slightest uncertainty. They had watched her stand at a stone wall for 22 minutes and talk to a child through it as naturally as if they were sitting in the same room, never once letting the tension she must have felt come through in her words or her tone. People who have spent time around Princess Anne often describe something similar, a kind of absolute reliability. Not warmth in the usual, obvious sense. Not softness. But a quality of being entirely present and entirely competent that has the same effect on people in difficult moments as warmth does. It makes them feel, despite everything, that things are going to be all right. George would later say, when someone close to the family asked him what it had been like in that room, that the part that had helped most was hearing her voice. Not the engineers, not the machinery, not even knowing that the door was being worked on. Her voice. Steady and calm, asking him about chalk writing and arguing builders, as though the most important thing in the world at that moment was to understand what those numbers on the wall had meant. He was right, in a way. It was the most important thing. Because it told him, without saying so directly, that the person on the other side of the wall was not afraid. And if she was not afraid, then perhaps he did not need to be afraid either. That is a particular kind of gift. Not everyone has it. It is not something that can be easily taught or quickly learned. It comes from a life lived in service to other people, from years of showing up and doing what is needed and asking for nothing in return. It comes from caring, deeply and consistently, about the people who depend on you, even when they are small, even when they are in a place they should not have gone, even when they are holding a piece of carved stone they want very much to keep. Windsor Castle stood as it always had that evening when the last light faded over the grounds. The east wing was quiet. The restoration equipment was covered and the corridor was empty. Somewhere in the castle, a clock struck the hour and the sound moved through the old stone walls the way sounds always had, absorbed and carried forward at the same time. And somewhere nearby, a boy who had spent part of his afternoon in a sealed room that nobody had entered in 100 years fell asleep thinking about chalk numbers and people who argued about measurements in the 1870s, entirely unharmed, entirely safe, and entirely certain that if something like this ever happened again, she would be there. Outside, the autumn wind moved quietly through the trees. The old stones of Windsor Castle held the day quietly, the way they had held every day before it and would hold every day to come.